Hello, my name is Kylie, and welcome to Ancient History, the Ancient Greeks Part 1. In this video, we will take a look at the basic events in ancient Greek history from just before their city-states were beginning to form in 800 BC until 146 BC when the Romans conquered them. We will first touch on the time period right before the Greek city-states were formed, the time period when these city-states thrived, and how they eventually fell apart amid war and conflict. Ready to journey into the past? Let's go! Before Greece was organized into city-states, smaller, separated communities existed. Small villages kept to themselves and tried to be self-sufficient as much as possible. A lot of small communities that made up Greece spread over an area of land far beyond what we now call the modern country of Greece. But over time, these small villages began to struggle to feed their people, get resources to build, and maintain houses, and defend themselves from enemies. One of the reasons it was so hard to grow enough food was that the land they lived on was super rocky and really dry. Around 800 BC, Greek city-states began to form. Small farming villages began to grow and trade with other communities. Much of the trade was done by sea, as travel over the rocky terrain or land was very difficult. These larger communities began to be called polis in Greek. Polis are city-states, which were small farming villages that grew into bigger cities. We now refer to these cities as city-states. City-states were like a city and a state all rolled into one. They had their own government and ruled themselves. Think of all the places or towns around where you live today. It would be like each one had its own president, and the rules were completely different in each one. As these city-states or polis grew, they began to become more organized. Often there was a huge fort on a large hill. This fort was huge and was called an acropolis. The word acropolis comes from the Greek words akro, which means high, and polis, which you already know what that means, city. So acropolis literally means high city in Greek. The Acropolis was also the center of religion and where farmers and other residents took shelter during times of attack. Outside the Acropolis were houses, apartments, and a large gathering place with a market called an agora. In the beginning of these city-states, many were ruled by a tyrant or someone who ruled by force. Each city-state had its own way of governing. Some had a system where rich, wealthy men shared power with a king or tyrant. Other city-states had a system where all free men took part in the government in groups called assemblies to make rules and laws. Assemblies met in a part of the Acropolis in their city. Most city-states had about 5,000 people. If a city-state became too big with too many people, it became very difficult to get enough food and resources for the people. When this happened, many city-states sent people to live in colonies in other areas. Some were as far away as North Africa, Southern Europe, and Asia Minor, which is part of Asia close to Greece. Then the city-state would trade with its colonies, so there would be enough resources for everyone. Two famous city-states that became larger and powerful were Sparta and Athens. They were very different in terms of how they governed themselves and how their culture or social structure developed. Sparta was a city-state that was very militaristic. This meant it focused a lot on its resources, time, and money on keeping up a strong army. Spartans valued physical fitness. Boys went to training camps at 7 years old and served in the military until the age of 30. Girls were also expected to keep physically fit, learn gymnastics, and to become the head of their household. Women often dealt with business. Spartan culture expected women to be strong and raise strong children. Slaves were kept by the government and not private people. They were called helots and were usually people the Spartans had captured during war. Spartan government was made up of an assembly of men. All the free men who were in the assembly were wealthy and heads of large, powerful families. They all had a vote on decisions made by the government, but the final decisions were made by the men called ephors. Ephors were the most powerful of these men. They were often the older men and were considered wise. They could decide to go against the votes of the others if they felt it was in the best interest of Sparta. This type of government system, where only a few men made decisions, is called an oligarchy. Spartan rulers did not like ideas from outside of Sparta. They wanted to keep their city and culture tightly controlled. Athens was a city-state that was very different from Sparta. It was where one of the first democracies was created. All free men aged 20 and older could vote. The majority ruled, which meant the idea that received the most votes would be chosen. Women and slaves could not yet vote. Athens also had slaves. However, slaves in Athens were considered private property. They could be bought and sold by private citizens. They, too, were often made up of people the Athenians conquered. They did most of the labor or work in Athens. Athens only made men serve in the military if there was an attack. They valued art and entertainment very much. Having public debates where 2 or more men discuss politics, religion, art, farming, or other ideas were very popular. Most city-states got along until resources started to run out. When this happened, city-states began to compete with each other for land and resources. For the 100 years between 500 BC and 400 BC, the Greek city-states were at constant conflict and often fought small battles with one another over land and resources. Then, in 480 BC, Persian invaders attacked Greece. The Greeks realized that if they stayed separate, no one city-state would be able to defend itself against the Persians. They decided to unite and banded together to defend themselves as a group. Despite joining together, the Greeks were still outnumbered, but they managed to defeat the Persians in a sea battle. After this, the Greeks decided it would be best to form alliances with one another and defend Greece together. The time that followed was to be known as Golden Age of Greece. The Golden Age of Greece began in about 479 BC and lasted until about 431 BC. This was a time of prosperity in Greek history. Prosperity means a time when people had a pretty good amount of money, were healthy, happy, new ideas were encouraged, and they were not at war. At the beginning of the Golden Age, Greeks were very proud they had defeated the Persians. Athens especially enjoyed a time when people became wealthier, healthier, and lived a more relaxed lifestyle. A famous leader, Pericles, was elected leader of Athens for 15 years in a row. He was very popular and thought no one should live too lavishly, meaning they shouldn't buy things they didn't need or show off their wealth. He also invented a system used in the US today, the jury system. In a court case, jurors were people who would decide if someone was innocent or guilty based on the facts and ideas presented by lawyers. They were paid for missing a day's work. Pericles wanted to make sure even the poorest member of Athens could afford to participate in the government. During this time, education was valued, schools were built, and great thinkers were encouraged to come up with new ideas and solutions to the city's problems. Plays, poetry, art, philosophy, and medicine flourished during this time. This means that these subjects were valued by the people. They invested money and a lot of time and effort into learning about them. We will explore more with these topics in Ancient History, the Greeks, Part 2. Unfortunately, the Golden Age ended when Athens and Sparta started to disagree once again. Both of these cities wanted to outdo the other and become the strongest. In 431 BC, a war broke out that lasted for 27 years. This became known as the Peloponnesian War because a group of smaller cities that supported Sparta was called the Peloponnesian League. On top of the war, a plague, or a deadly sickness, spread and killed many, many people. Athens was very crowded because of the war. Farmers had moved into the city for protection. This eventually spread the plague even more, and 25% of the entire Athenian army died. Pericles also passed away, and the people of Athens were without a leader. Because they were desperate in times of war, the Athenian people chose people to lead them that turned out to be horrible leaders. These types of leaders are called demagogues. Demagogues make promises that they cannot keep and also make bad decisions. From 326 to 332 BC, Alexander the Great came into power over all the Greek city-states. Alexander took over the rule of Greece from his father Philip, who defeated the Athenians in 338 BC. Philip was assassinated in 336 BC while attending his daughter's wedding. Philip and Alexander ruled their own country called Macedonia. Alexander's parents had raised him to learn everything he could about Greece, and when it came into power, he was well prepared to rule over the Greeks. Alexander also wanted to rule over as many other lands as possible. He fought to free colonies that were once Greek but had been taken over by Persia. Despite having great success in taking over huge areas of land that stretched from Egypt to the edge of India, Alexander wanted even more. His greed was making his soldiers angry, and they were tired of fighting. On his last push to get more land to rule, they refused to follow. Just after that, he fell ill and died in 323 BC. No one was strong enough to take over such a large empire, and it broke up. Generals who were in his army fought for control. Because of this, the Greeks weren't united or strong enough to fight against the Romans, who would eventually rule over much of the area. The ancient Greek Empire was gone, as the Romans took over in 146 BC. Remember, this is just an overview of ancient Greek history from the time period from 800 BC until 146 BC. If you would like to learn more, you have many options. First, watch the second part of this series, Ancient History, the Ancient Greeks Part 2. Your local library will have a lot more information as well. Ask an adult to help you research the topic on the web. You can also check out our other ancient history videos. Practice what you've learned using our fun online games and quizzes. Remember to think about the past, connect it to the present, and to always be clever. Hey, hey.